Old oak tree stood at the very edge of my front yard, its sprawling branches reaching out as if to welcome anyone who passed. It wasn't just a tree. It was a century-old living monument, planted by my great-grandfather, the very weak. He built the house in 1923. Over the years, storms had tried to tear it down. Dry seasons had threatened its roots, and cold winters had stripped it bare. But every spring it came back stronger, greener, fuller. It had been there before the subdivision existed, before there was a homeowners association, before the tidy row of modern houses sprouted up around my corner lot. To me, it wasn't only part of my property, it was part of my family's history. The thick, weathered trunk carried the initials of every generation that lived here, carved gently into its bark during summer afternoons. Under its shade, countless family gatherings had taken place. Children played, picnics were shared, and memories were made. Most neighbors respected it. They knew its history, and many admired the canopy that offered cool shade to the street. But one person didn't see the beauty, the history, or the value. To her, it was an eyesore, an inconvenience. That person was Karen. Karen moved into the house across the street about a year earlier. She came with her spotless SUV, her clipped flower beds, and her obsession with keeping everything perfectly aligned to her standards. I'd seen her trimming her lawn with scissors, adjusting her porch lights by a fraction of an inch, and standing in her driveway with her arms crossed, glaring at anything she deemed out of place. It didn't take long before I heard her comments. Small, pointed remarks about the tree. At first they came casually, like the kind of thing you could dismiss as a neighbor's passing opinion. She mentioned how big it was, how it blocked a portion of her view of the mountains in the distance. She even once said it cast a shadow across the street during golden hour, as if that was some sort of offense. The comments became more frequent, more persistent. She'd linger on the sidewalk, looking up at the branches as if they were plotting against her. She'd point her phone at it and take photos, muttering under her breath. Then came the first formal complaint. An email to the HOA board claiming that my oak was encroaching on the neighborhood's shared space and posed a risk in high winds. The HOA sent me a notice, but it was quickly dismissed after an inspection. The tree was healthy, secure, and entirely on my property. The roots, the trunk, the canopy, all well within my boundary lines. I thought that would be the end of it, but I underestimated how far Karen was willing to go. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of machinery, the low, rumbling growl of an engine, the sharp whine of a chainsaw. I assumed it was someone doing yard work down the street, but the sound was close, far too close. I stepped outside and froze. A crew of 3 men in safety vests were standing at the base of my oak, cutting into its limbs. Branches that had shaded this yard for decades crashed to the ground. Sawdust swirled in the summer air. My heart dropped. Karen stood on the sidewalk with her hands on her hips, supervising like she was directing a movie. Her face was set in that smug, self-satisfied look she wore whenever she thought she was fixing something. In that moment, I felt a mix of rage and disbelief. This wasn't a trim. It wasn't maintenance. This was removal. My tree, my family's oak, was being dismantled piece by piece, and I hadn't given permission. I rushed over, but by the time I reached the base of the tree, one of the largest branches had already been hauled into the back of a truck. The sound of the saw was deafening, drowning out the pounding of my pulse. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stop them. But I knew one thing. If Karen was bold enough to order this, she was probably arrogant enough to think she was in the right. That meant there had to be proof, paperwork, invoices, something that would tie her to the destruction she'd set in motion. For now, I could only watch in shock as the crew continued. Every cut felt like a punch to the gut. Every crash of a branch hitting, the ground echoed with the weight of decades of history being stolen. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, the oak was no longer standing tall and proud. All that remained was a wide stump, raw and exposed, surrounded by scattered bark and leaves. The yard felt empty. The street felt different. My home felt smaller. Karen, however, seemed pleased. She gave the crew a nod, pulled a folded check from her pocket, and handed it to their foreman. Then she turned toward her driveway, glanced in my direction, and smirked before disappearing into her house. That smirk was the final push I needed. She thought this was over. She thought she could erase a piece of my history without consequence, but she had no idea what she had just done. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. This was about property rights, about accountability, about justice. And I was going to make sure she paid, literally, for every inch of that oak. The next step was obvious. I needed proof of the tree's value. And I knew exactly who to call. Chapter 2. Putting a Price on History. The yard looked naked without the oak. I stood at the edge of the stump that evening, the air thick with the scent of fresh-cut wood. It wasn't just emptiness I felt. It was violation. Something irreplaceable was gone, not by nature's hand, but by the deliberate choice of someone who thought her personal comfort outweighed my rights. I took photographs from every angle, the jagged remains of the trunk, the scattered debris, the fresh tire tracks left by the crew's truck. I captured Karen's house in the background, the same vantage point she always used to glare at the tree. Each image felt like another piece of ammunition for the battle ahead. This wasn't going to be a neighborhood squabble. This was going to be a legal war. The next morning, I contacted a certified arborist, someone with the credentials not only to assess the tree's condition, but also to determine its monetary value. He agreed to meet me that afternoon. When he arrived, he didn't just glance at the stump and leave. He examined the growth rings, took soil samples, and measured the diameter with practiced precision. His notes were meticulous. Every scrape, every cut mark from the chainsaw was documented. He explained something I had always suspected, but never truly considered. My oak wasn't just any tree. It was a heritage specimen, rare for its age, size, and health. A living asset. In the right conditions, trees like mine weren't just landscaping. They were valued like fine art or historic property features. When he finally looked up from his clipboard, the number he gave me made my chest tighten. $50,000. Not about 50,000. Not in the ballpark. Exactly 50,000 based on regional valuation formulas, environmental benefits, and its historical significance. Hearing that figure shifted my anger into something sharper. Determination. Karen hadn't just killed a tree. She had destroyed an asset worth more than some people's cars. More than a year's salary. More than she could probably fathom. With the report in hand, I called my attorney. He had handled a few HOA-related disputes for me in the past. And while this wasn't technically an HOA action, it fell squarely under property damage and trespass. The more I explained, the quieter he became, the kind of silence that meant he was already building a strategy in his head. He asked the questions I had been hoping for. Was the tree entirely on my property? Yes. Did I have any written consent or communication approving its removal? No, because I had never agreed to it. Could the arborist testify in court? Absolutely. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. He told me this was not just a civil matter. This could potentially rise to the level of criminal mischief. Depending on state statutes about intentional destruction of property, the plan was simple in theory but devastating in execution. First, a formal demand letter would be sent to Karen, outlining the valuation, the evidence, and the required payment in full. If she refused, and we both knew she would, we'd move to file a lawsuit seeking damages, legal fees, and additional compensation for the loss of enjoyment and property value. But we weren't going to stop there. The arborist's report included environmental calculations and the amount of oxygen the tree produced annually, the carbon dioxide it absorbed, even its role in reducing stormwater runoff. Those figures, while not directly tied to market value, painted a picture for a jury of just how valuable that oak had been. I spent the next 2 days gathering everything I could. Copies of old photographs showing the tree over decades, family albums with picnics under its branches, even a grainy black-and-white snapshot of my great-grandfather planting it. I wanted the court and Karen to feel the weight of what she had taken. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on her. She went about her routine as if nothing had happened, watering her perfectly manicured front lawn, arranging her patio furniture, waving to certain neighbors while avoiding my gaze entirely. That smugness was still there, hidden behind her oversized sunglasses. She didn't think there would be consequences. The demand letter went out at the end of the week. My attorney made sure it was delivered by hand, the kind of delivery that required her to physically sign for it. I imagined her expression when she opened it, the widening eyes, the flicker of disbelief, the sudden realization that this wasn't going to fade away quietly. But Karen didn't show fear. Not yet. She doubled down. Instead of reaching out to negotiate, she sent a message through the HOA, claiming she had acted in the interest of neighborhood safety and that the tree had been a hazard. She had addressed on behalf of the community. That was her first mistake. She had just publicly admitted to being the one responsible. Her second mistake came a day later when she posted a smug, thinly veiled comment on the neighborhood Facebook page about how much better the view is now. That little digital breadcrumb was captured in a screenshot and added to my growing pile of evidence. The stage was set. My attorney filed the lawsuit. The court date was scheduled. And as the papers were served to Karen, in full view of the neighbors, I knew this was just the beginning. The real fight hadn't even started yet. Chapter 3. The Cracks in Her Armor. The day Karen was served the lawsuit was the first time I saw the veneer of control slip from her face. She stood on her porch, frozen, as the process server handed over the thick envelope. Her hand trembled just slightly as she signed, though she quickly forced a smirk when she realized neighbors were watching. She retreated inside, but the blinds in her front window twitched within minutes. She was reading the paperwork, and I knew exactly what she was seeing. The valuation, the photographs, the appraisal report, the screenshots, and the demand for $50,000 plus legal fees. The neighborhood quieted over the next few days, the way it does when gossip becomes too big to ignore. People weren't openly talking about the lawsuit, but you could feel the shift. Conversation stopped when I walked by. Lawn chairs turned subtly toward my property, eyes lingering just a little too long. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen. I stayed focused. This wasn't about public opinion. It was about proving the truth in a court of law. My attorney began preparing the case with surgical precision. Every piece of evidence was organized, labeled, and cross-referenced. The arborist agreed to testify, and we secured an expert in property law to explain the legal consequences of unauthorized removal of personal assets. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to be building a defense rooted in denial. She began telling anyone who would listen that the tree had been a danger to the neighborhood and that she had saved everyone from a potential tragedy. She painted herself as a civic hero, conveniently ignoring the fact that not a single branch had fallen from that oak in over 50 years. Her bravado didn't last. About a week before the preliminary hearing, her attorney sent mine an informal message, an attempt to settle. They offered a payment far below the appraised value, framing it as a gesture of goodwill to avoid a long, drawn-out legal process. We rejected it without hesitation. This wasn't a yard sale where you could haggle down the price of damage. The number wasn't negotiable because the value wasn't a guess. It was backed by professional evaluation and irrefutable documentation. That rejection seemed to push Karen into a new phase, subtle intimidation. I began noticing her lingering in her driveway whenever I came or went, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on me like a challenge. On 2 occasions, I found tire tracks across the corner of my lawn. Small, petty acts meant to send a message. If she thought those gestures would unsettle me, she underestimated just how prepared I was to see this through. Every tire mark was photographed. Every suspicious movement was noted. If she wanted to add to the list of her own bad decisions, I was more than happy to let her. Meanwhile, my attorney secured additional testimony from a city forestry official. He explained that removing heritage trees without proper permits was not just a civil violation. In some cases, it could trigger municipal fines on top of private damages. The official confirmed that no permit had been filed for my oak's removal. That meant Karen's good deed wasn't just unauthorized. It was illegal on multiple levels. The more evidence we compiled, the more I realized how airtight this case had become. We had motive, her obsession with the view. We had opportunity, her hiring of the crew. We had direct admission, her HOA letter claiming responsibility. And we had quantifiable damages backed by experts. When the day of the preliminary hearing arrived, Karen walked into the courthouse in a neatly pressed suit, her hair perfect, her expression carefully neutral. But the way she clutched her purse strap told me she was rattled. Her attorney avoided eye contact with me, flipping through papers that, by now, he probably knew spelled disaster for his client. The hearing itself was brief. Procedural, just enough to set the timeline for the full trial. But as we left the courthouse, the atmosphere was different. The whispers among the neighbors had turned into quiet, certainty. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now she was trapped in a fight she couldn't win. Still, I knew better than to assume victory was inevitable. People like Karen often fought hardest when the odds were against them. Pride could make a person reckless, and recklessness could still cause damage. The court date was now locked in for 6 weeks away. Between now and then, we would fine-tune every detail of the case. And if Karen wanted to turn this into a spectacle, I was prepared to let her, because every move she made from here on out would only make the ending worse for her. As I stood in my front yard that evening, the stump of the oak still raw and exposed, I imagined the day I would stand before a judge and watch Karen hear the ruling. The thought didn't bring me joy exactly, but it did bring a sense of justice. She had taken something irreplaceable from me. Now I was going to take something from her. The illusion that she could act without consequences. Chapter 4. The Trial Opens. The morning of the trial arrived with a gray sky and a restless wind. It was fitting, almost poetic, a kind of tension in the air that mirrored the weight of what was about to unfold. I arrived at the courthouse early, my attorney already inside, reviewing the binders of evidence we had compiled over the past month and a half. Every photo, every report, every piece of written proof had been organized, so cleanly that it almost looked too simple. But the real strength wasn't in the volume of paper, it was in how each page built upon the last, forming a case as solid as the oak that had once stood in my yard. Karen arrived minutes later, stepping out of her SUV with her attorney at her side. She had dressed deliberately, a modest blouse, a plain skirt, her hair pulled back as if trying to shed the image of the self-appointed neighborhood enforcer and replace it with that of a reasonable, concerned citizen. She kept her chin high, her pace brisk, but I could see the strain in her movements. Her eyes flickered briefly in my direction before she looked away, pretending not to notice me. The courtroom was quiet when we entered. The judge, a seasoned figure with a reputation for cutting through theatrics, glanced over the docket and called the case to order. From the very first words spoken, it was clear this would be a battle of facts versus narrative. My attorney's strategy was straightforward: present the truth in its entirety, without embellishment, and let the evidence do the damage. The opening statement set the tone. My side laid out the timeline, the history of the oak, the repeated complaints from Karen, the unauthorized removal, and the professional valuation of the loss. We framed it not as a petty dispute, but as a serious act of property destruction with measurable financial and emotional consequences. Karen's attorney took the opposite approach. He described her as a responsible neighbor, acting out of concern for public safety, claiming she believed the tree was unstable and could cause injury or property damage during storms. He emphasized her good intentions, sidestepping the fact that she had no official inspection, no permit, and no right to make that decision. Then came the witnesses. The arborist was the first to take the stand. He spoke with calm authority, walking the court through his measurements, the tree's age, its pristine health, and the calculated market value. He explained how heritage oaks contribute to property value and how their removal, especially without consent, can constitute significant financial harm. When Karen's attorney tried to suggest the tree might have been in decline, the arborist didn't flinch. He produced photographs from his inspection showing the solid core of the trunk, the absence of disease, and the stability of the root system. Next was the city forestry official. His testimony was even more damning. He confirmed that no removal permit had been filed, that the tree was not listed as a hazard in city records, and that unauthorized removal of a heritage specimen could result in municipal fines in addition to civil damages. His words carried the weight of regulation and authority, and I watched Karen's posture stiffen as he spoke. Finally, my attorney introduced the photographic evidence, the before and after, shots of my property, the fresh cut of the stump, the wide canopy that had once shaded the street. The images were more than just visuals. They were a silent but powerful argument, each one a reminder of what had been lost. Karen's side tried to counter with character. Witnesses, a couple of neighbors willing to claim they felt safer without the oak nearby. But under cross-examination, both admitted they had never seen the tree drop branches, had never filed a complaint, and had relied solely on Karen's opinion when forming their own. As the hours passed, I could feel the momentum shifting. Every attempt at framing her actions as necessary was met with the cold, factual reality that they were unauthorized, unnecessary, and financially devastating. The more the truth emerged, the more Karen's defense began to fray at the edges. By the time the judge called for a recess, I could sense the tide had fully turned. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the courtroom. Her attorney leaned toward her, speaking in low, urgent tones, but she barely reacted. When the recess ended, the judge announced that closing arguments would be delivered the following day, with a verdict to follow shortly after. That meant one more night before the decision. One more night, where the weight of what she had done would sit heavily on her shoulders. As I left the courthouse, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the steps. I paused for a moment, imagining what it would feel like to finally hear the ruling, to finally see in writing that her arrogance had consequences. Tomorrow, the end would begin. Chapter 5. Judgment Day. The next morning, the courthouse seemed quieter than usual, as if the building itself understood the weight of what was about to be decided. I arrived early again, but this time I felt a stillness in my chest. Not calm exactly, but the steady awareness that months of preparation had brought us to this single day. Karen arrived minutes later, her appearance more subdued than before. The sharp, assertive posture she had carried into the trial had softened into something almost defensive. Her steps were slower, her gaze fixed on the ground as she followed her attorney inside. Whatever confidence she had left was fraying, and I could see it in the way she avoided looking at anyone. The judge took the bench promptly, wasting no time in calling the court to order. Closing arguments began. My attorney spoke first. His voice was even, deliberate, every sentence anchored in the facts we had laid bare over the past day. He reminded the court of the oak's age, its pristine health, its appraised value, and its irreplaceable presence in the neighborhood. He revisited the arborist's testimony, the city official's confirmation of its protected status, and the photographs showing the stark absence left behind. Then came the crucial point: intent. This wasn't an accident. Karen had not acted in haste to prevent imminent danger. She had planned the removal, hired a crew, supervised the work, and paid for it without so much as a conversation with the rightful owner. The result was the destruction of property valued at $50,000, along with a permanent loss that could never be reversed. He finished with the reminder that property rights mean nothing if they can be ignored. Whenever someone decides they know better, the law existed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral decision-making, and now it was the court's duty to enforce it. When Karen's attorney stood, the contrast was striking. His tone was softer than before, almost conciliatory. He repeated the narrative of concern for safety, painting her as a neighbor acting in good faith to prevent potential harm. He tried to suggest that $50,000 was an inflated valuation, even though two independent experts had confirmed it. But there was no energy behind his words. He was not arguing from a place of strength. He was trying to salvage what little ground was left. When both sides finished, the judge didn't immediately rule. Instead, she took a long pause, flipping through her notes. The silence in the room was heavy. I could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock, each second stretching longer than the last. Then she began to speak. Her words were measured, deliberate, but there was no ambiguity. The evidence, she said, was overwhelming. The removal of the tree had been unauthorized. The valuation was well supported and reasonable given the size, health, and historical significance of the oak. The act had been deliberate, not emergent, and no credible evidence had been presented to suggest the tree posed a danger that required immediate removal. She ruled in my favor. Full damages of $50,000, plus court costs and attorney's fees. Furthermore, she noted that municipal fines for unauthorized removal of a protected heritage tree would be pursued separately by the city, outside the scope of this case. For a moment, I didn't move. The decision landed like a sudden break in storm clouds, sunlight spilling through after weeks of overcast tension. Across the aisle, Karen's face drained of color. She stared straight ahead, her mouth tight, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The gavel struck, and just like that, it was over. The trial, the months of gathering evidence, the hours in court, All of it had led to this final indisputable outcome. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. I stood on the steps, watching people filter out into the street, and caught a glimpse of Karen as she exited a side door with her attorney. She didn't look at me, didn't speak, didn't make any of the gestures she had relied on to project control. Her steps were quick, her posture hunched. The money wouldn't bring back the oak. Nothing could. But the ruling wasn't just about compensation. It was a statement. Actions have consequences. Property lines mean something. And arrogance, when left unchecked, will eventually find its limit in the law. I knew there would be paperwork to finalize, payments to process, and likely more petty behavior from Karen before she accepted the loss. But the legal battle was finished. The rest was just cleanup, and as I walked to my car, the stump of the oak flashed in my mind, not as a wound anymore, but as a reminder of a fight won and a line drawn that would never be crossed again. Chapter 6. Aftermath and the Long Fall. The courthouse victory had been decisive, but in the days that followed, the real weight of the ruling began to settle over the neighborhood. It wasn't just the financial judgment, it was the shift in perception. Karen, once loud and commanding in her opinions about everyone else's property, now carried an invisible shadow wherever she went. Word traveled fast. The official court documents became public record, and within a week, nearly every resident in the subdivision had either read them or heard a detailed retelling, conversations that had once revolved around Karen's demands for compliance with her. Personal standards now revolved around her loss in court. Even those who had once quietly sided with her began to put distance between themselves and her driveway. The financial hit came next. $50,000 plus legal fees was not a sum that could be brushed off as an inconvenience. My attorney handled the process with precision, ensuring that payment was pursued promptly and legally. The court's order required full payment within a specific window, and interest would accrue on any late balance. She didn't pay immediately. For a time, she tried to delay, filing small, procedural requests through her attorney, all of which were rejected by the judge. Each rejection meant more court costs for her, more strain on whatever resources she had left. Eventually, the first check arrived, covering a portion of the total. It wasn't an admission of defeat in her mind, perhaps, but in reality, it was the beginning of a debt she couldn't escape. While the civil judgment played out, the city moved forward with its own process. The forestry department issued a formal fine for the unauthorized removal of a heritage tree, a separate penalty that, while smaller than the court's award, still carried a sting. More importantly, it became part of her record, a permanent mark that couldn't be erased by a new coat of paint or a fresh lawn edging. I left the stump in place for a while. Part of it was practicality. It would take time and planning to decide what should replace the oak, but part of it was deliberate. The raw, weathered cut served as a silent monument to what had happened. Neighbors would pass by, glance at it, and remember the trial, the testimony, the verdict. Karen, for her part, began retreating from public life. She no longer lingered in her driveway or patrolled the street with a clipboard of imagined violations. Her car remained in her garage for long stretches, and when she did appear, she moved quickly, her head down, avoiding eye contact. The loudest voice in the neighborhood had become the quietest. Months later, when the final payment cleared and the legal chapter was officially closed, I decided it was time to act. I hired a landscaping company to design a new focal point for the yard. Not another oak, but a stone memorial bench, placed exactly where the tree had stood. Set into the bench was a small bronze plaque with an inscription that simply read, "In memory of the oak, 1923 to 2023. Some things cannot be replaced, only remembered." It was subtle enough to seem like a personal tribute, but for those who knew the story, it carried a sharper edge. The bench became a place where I could sit in the evenings, watching the sun dip low over the street, knowing that what had been taken from me had, in some way, been avenged. Life in the neighborhood moved on, but the balance had shifted. The lesson had been delivered, not through shouting matches or backyard feuds, but through the unyielding process of the law. Karen's arrogance had met its limit, and the consequences had been written into her finances, her reputation, and her record. In the end, the oak was gone, but so was the idea that my property could be altered by someone else's will. That was the real victory. And as the seasons turned, the stump weathered to silver gray, its surface smooth under the touch of time. I found a certain peace in its presence. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a warning, one that would stand long after both Karen and I had moved on. Thanks for watching HOA Stories, where real drama meets real justice.